Senator Lyons.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President, and thank you for taking my chair's duty. I rise this morning to oppose the Construction Industry Amendment Protecting Witnesses Bill 2014, and I think we just need some background on this bill. And what we've seen from the Abbott government is it attacks all sections of the Australian community. If it's not pensioners, it's attacking its families. If it's not families, it's attacking its young people. If it's not young people, it's attacking the unemployed. If the unemployed aren't under attack, it's the homeless. And if the homeless aren't under attack, then it's refugees, workers and unions, particularly the CFMEU. They are all under attack from this government. It is indeed a partisan government, a government that governs only for the big end of town. And any group, any individual who threatens to disrupt that relationship, that partisan relationship, comes under attack from the Abbott government. And this bill does just that, seeks to protect the interests of only one group. The Construction Industry Amendment Protecting Witnesses Bill of 2015 is another example of the Abbott government's ideology, its Tea Party agenda, its agenda to simply agree with its mates at the big end of town. And this bill, regardless of what you'll hear from the government, seeks to extend the coercive powers which Justice Wilcox said required not just a sunset clause, but a review, a proper review, a review that took into account all points of view, not just a chat with the Abbott government's mates at the big end of town, but a proper review with a terms of reference and an independent chair. But of course we've never seen any independence from the Abbott government, never. It takes a partisan view on every single thing it does. And let's have a look at what's at stake here. We've heard from the other side today all sorts of innuendo, exaggeration and untruths about a whole range of matters. But the simple facts are that there are currently laws in place which deal with corruption wherever it occurs, and Labor's on the record, as are the unions, to say that we don't support corruption. Labor is on the record as saying we don't support illegal behaviour. And indeed, there are powers within the current Fair Work regime and the Fair Work Building Act to deal with the whole manner of complaints where people assert there's been some kind of illegal behaviour, whether that's employer behaviour or union behaviour or worker behaviour. The laws are there. But of course we never hear that from the Abbott government. You certainly never hear about the bad behaviour of employers, where lockouts occur, where people have their rosters illegally changed, where they get underpaid. None of that ever comes before the remit of the Abbott government, because they like to demonise unions and they like to demonise particularly the CFMEU. And Labor government did act when we were in power, but certainly what we did was fair and just. And we abolished the draconian Australian Building and Construction Bill that was established by the former Liberal government, and we established the Fair Work Building Inspectorate. And in establishing the new body, we acted on our election commitment at the time to consult widely on its operations and its functions. And to that end, as many in here have mentioned, we asked the respected former Justice Wilcox to undertake consultation and prepare a report on matters related to the creation of a specialist division of the Inspector of Fair Work Australia. And indeed, Mr Wilcox provided a report to government in 2009, and the bill which gave effect to Mr Wilcox's principal recommendations was legislated in 2012. And that sunset clause was put into the legislation, and it required, and it should require, any government to justify with evidence the need to extend that clause. And we heard this morning that there's been consultation. Well, there simply has not been consultation. There's been chats with the big end of town. There's been no formal consultation with the ACTU. There's been no formal consultation with any of the construction unions because this government doesn't believe in formal, independent processes. It just believes in innuendo and exaggeration. That's what they've done. They've simply exaggerated, continued to tell the stories they like to tell in here, which are half-truths and exaggerations, and say that somehow there's been some kind of consultation. So there's been no formal, independent review of the very serious issues that Justice Wilcox entertained, and there's been no serious, proper, independent review of the legislation that Labor put in place. Just hearsay, exaggeration, innuendo and untruths. That's the extent that we've heard from the Abbott government. And until the government provides such evidence as to the merits or otherwise of extending the sunset clause, Labor is not in a position to have an informed view on this matter. And of course, the government would rather keep making it up, keep the exaggeration and innuendo going, because that suits their political agenda. So Labor calls on the government to conduct the review rather than using the sunset provisions as a political stunt in their never-ending crusade against the union movement. And additionally, the government's bill, which they try to say is some kind of replication of what's already there, seeks to reinstate the draconian Australian Building and Construction Commission. It removes the important safeguards Mr Wilcox identified and Labor enacted, that the ABC Commissioner needs to apply to a President member of the AAT for an examination note. The government also seeks to remove the privilege against self-incrimination. So what we have here is a government saying they merely want to extend the operation of the powers, and we've heard that this morning from government senators, but that is patently untrue. In reality, what the Abbott government really wants to do, and it is clearly evident in their bill to reinstate the ABCC, is to impose more coercive powers with fewer protections and safeguards on their use. And it's important to note, even if this bill is not successful, the Fair Work Ombudsman and those within Fair Work Building Industry Inspectorate who are appointed as Fair Work inspectors currently have the power to compel the production of records or documents to assist in investigating industrial contraventions. And we never hear about that. We hear stories, but we never hear where matters have been referred. And of course, there is also the Australian Crime Commission, which has significant coercive powers available to investigate allegations of criminality. And it's also worth noting that the Fair Work Building and Construction's annual report details that coercive powers were used only four times in 2013-14. So all the stories we've heard in here this morning, of course, don't require those coercive powers. All of those stories don't require workers being pursued in the way the government wants to pursue it in this bill. And of course, what we know from Senate inquiries and other areas is the failure of the government to review is the partisan manner in which the FWBI has operated since the election of the Abbott government. So what do we say? We say here in this place, we've heard it this morning, this demonisation of unions, particularly the CFMEU, go on and on, under the guise of parliamentary privilege. And Labor has said over and over again, if matters are serious, then they should be investigated. If matters are serious, then the Abbott government, if it has evidence or information that it hasn't made available to the proper authorities, ought to do so as a matter of urgency. And the only time the Abbott government attack the CFMEU, or indeed officials of the CFMEU, is under the guise of parliamentary privilege. Now, that tells you in and of itself that they have nothing to justify these continued attacks. Because if they did, their obligation is to report. Their obligation is to have the proper independent authorities investigate these matters. But that does not suit their political agenda. Their political agenda is about demonising particular parts of our community, and in this case, it's the unions. And this particular bill has been shrouded in secrecy, introduced into the parliament in March, but no public hearing on this bill. So not only do we not have the proper independent review that should have been conducted, but we've not had an open public inquiry into this bill. Despite having the time to do it, the bill was introduced in March. The reporting date back to the Senate from the Senate committee was May. And yes, we've had inquiries into other aspects of the building industry, the construction industry, but this required and should have had a public review in and of itself, where we can have witnesses talk further to their submissions, where we can have additional information brought to the committee. But of course that didn't suit the government, did not suit the Abbott government to have that public inquiry, because their attacks under parliamentary privilege may well have been challenged in that Senate inquiry. But we'll never know that, Mr Deputy President, because we never had that opportunity of that public open inquiry process, despite there being ample time. And when I looked at the submissions from the employers, it was almost as if the employers at the big end of town, ACCI, the master builders and so on, and the government were speaking with one voice. So all I saw in the submissions from the employers and the employer associations were further innuendo, further exaggeration, further hearsay about this general nature of industrial unrest in the construction industry. And nothing could be further from the truth. There's been a decline in days lost to industrial action, but you don't hear that from the Abbott government. There's been a decline in the number of days lost to industrial action. Industrial action properly constituted as part of a bargaining process, but you won't hear that from the Abbott government as well. And of course the serious issues in the building industry, the continued increasing of deaths in the construction industry, is not something you will ever hear the Abbott government speak about. Last year, 28 tragic deaths in the building industry. And what did the Abbott government have to say about that? Not one word. Not one single word from the Abbott government about those deaths. And shamefully, they're up 11 more deaths than in the previous calendar year. The previous calendar year there were 17. Last year there were 28. Do we have legislation before us to urgently address those deaths in the construction industry? No, of course we don't, because it does not suit their political agenda. Their political agenda is about demonising unions, not protecting workers, because if they were genuine about protecting workers, they would do something immediately about the 28 deaths in the construction industry, and indeed in all of the industries. The deaths are much higher than that. No Australian worker should lose their life earning their livelihood, and yet it goes completely unnoticed by the Abbott government. Because when I asked the Department of Employment what they were doing about this increase in deaths, in workplace deaths, they were told me they were continuing to apply their 10-year plan. And when I suggested to the department that seemingly because of this tragic, unnecessary increase in deaths, that perhaps their plan needed to be reviewed, they didn't think that was the case. And that's because the government is not leading on this issue. The government is not leading on workplace deaths. Imagine, I can't imagine, the effect on families, on friends and on workplaces when a death occurs at the workplace. We are better than this. Australian workplaces should be death-free. But that is not the agenda of this Abbott government, because there's been complete silence, not even a condolence to those families, a plan to say this is a national tragedy and we are going to act on it. No. The demonisation of the unions continues. And the unions are trying to do something about deaths on the construction industry, and yet when they use their right of entry to investigate a health matter, a health and safety matter, the Abbott government accuses them of not pursuing health and safety. Well, the record speaks for itself. You can't have 28 deaths in an industry and suggest that that industry is a safe place to work, because clearly it is not. And officials, union officials, have a right to go in. But going in after a death is too late. We need to stop the deaths occurring right now, and I want to see action from the Abbott government on that. But I suspect that I will continue to see silence. So, we've seen the coercive powers used just 4 times. Just 4 times. We've also seen of late workers in this country being ripped off, wages going underpaid, workers being treated appallingly, and yet the emphasis still remains on the construction industry, where we've seen less industrial action, proper legal industrial action as per the Fair Work rights in relation to enterprise bargaining. We've seen less lost time, and yet that is not something you will hear from the Abbott government. They won't admit to that. They won't admit to that. And it is time they started to admit that the construction industry in Australia is a dangerous place to work. In fact, we should be reviewing all of our workplace health and safety and acting immediately to stop any more deaths in this industry. But no, the demonisation will continue. And so we will continue to stand, and I stand proudly, as many Labor senators do, and I do support unions and I do support workers, and I do want to see action on health and safety issues. And of course I support where individuals have broken the law and that assertion is made or that allegation is made, then there are proper procedures in place to deal with it. But we don't hear that either. We don't hear that from those opposite, because they would rather, under the guise of parliamentary privilege, continue telling untruths, exaggeration and hearsay. And it isn't appropriate that if they have some evidence, it is not appropriate to be raising it in this place and not raising it with the appropriate agencies that are there to deal with those issues. Their Tea Party ideology, and nobody is fooled anymore. If there's a state election coming up, then you can bet your bottom dollar that unions will be demonised in this place. Their agenda is so transparent. They don't fool anyone with their right-wing ideology, their Tea Party ideology of demonising unions. They don't fool workers and they don't fool the Australian voters. And they should look at some of the programs the CFMEU's got in place. FIFO suicides, a big problem in Western Australia, not even regarded as a death in the workplace. The CFMEU's done some fabulous work on putting mentors in place to ask their workmates, are they okay? Good programs. They've got good programs in place around domestic violence, but you won't hear about that from the Abbott government. They've got good programs around health and safety, but the Abbott government would rather say they're abusing their powers when they enter the workplace to talk about health and safety. So let's hear about some of the good things that are going on. And yes, if there's the law being broken, let's pursue it. But let's stop demonising and pretending. Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President.
Thank you.